thing about trying to track down the origin of a conspiracy theory is it's a lot like trying to track down the origin of a river. There are so many branches and backwaters contributing to a river, you can never entirely pin down which specific branch can rightly be called the origin. And for those of you who just clicked on this video randomly, you should know that this is the fourth and final video in a series about the war in Ukraine. So I'm skipping around a lot here over things I covered in earlier videos, which you can watch here. So you'll have to forgive me if I meander a bit. You get it? Meander? You know, because it's like a river.
You win? You have a problem with that? You know what you should do? You should sanction me. Sanction me with your army. Oh, wait a minute. You don't have an army. I guess that means you need to shut the up. That's what I do.
After 9/11, America launched multiple wars of aggression, created a global system of enforced disappearance and torture, tore up international law, intentionally pitted Western Europe against Eastern Europe, and massively destabilized the Middle East. I'm not interested in making a comparison between the war in Iraq and the war in Ukraine. What I am interested in is the similarities between America itself, its political culture in those years, and Russia today. And not just similar in the broad strokes, but in the details. The gloating at the beginning, fading into an insistence that the army is being too soft.
So I'm trusting the government. And then when you see made in France, made in France, made in France, which are going to uncover a lot of that stuff, all right, it's going to be, the fallout to this is going to be substantial. Talking Points believes the Bush administration has to stop being defensive about waging war. At this point, the new Iraqi government should declare martial law in areas controlled by insurgents. That means anyone can be arrested and shoot on-site curfews. Saddam was able to control Iraq, as you know, and defeat insurgencies against him. The new Iraqi government can do the same.
The victim blaming.
How could you salvage Iraq at this point?
It's beyond our control. I mean, if somehow the Iraqis decided to behave like human beings or something.
The goofy Christian nationalism.
Lieutenant General William Boykin is in charge of tracking down top terror targets, but Boykin, an evangelical Christian, says neither man is America's true enemy.
The enemy is spiritual. It's called the principality of darkness, and the enemy is a guy called Satan.
They had the same obsession with European decadence.
The continent of Europe is dark, it's hopelessly lost, and it's going to get worse, and every expert will tell you that by the middle of this century, the continent of Europe will be an Islamic continent.
And they both had gay fascism.
There is a gay and secular fascism in this country that wants to impose its will on the rest of us, is prepared to use violence.
Oh, and incitement to genocide.
We need to kill them. We need to kill them.
We didn't think these people would act like savages.
It's all coming from the Iraqi scum, and I'm going to say it like it is. The vermin we're fighting.
In a sane world, every country would unite against Iran and blow it off the face of the earth. That would be the same
wealthy people. They are very depressed by the weakness that America is showing in the Muslim world. They say, oh, there's a billion of them. I said, so kill 100 million of them. Then there'll be 900 million of them. I mean, would you rather die? Would you rather us die than them? I mean, what is it going to take for you people to wake up? Because you're going to have to make that choice sooner rather than later.
When I was a kid, I thought this is just what normal politics was. And then when I grew up, I thought it was just an emotional reaction to a once-in-a-lifetime terror attack, and I'd never see it again. But now I see it every time I open Julia Davis's Twitter account. I can't think about Vladimir Soloviev without thinking about early Fox News. I can't see the same dim-witted indifference of regular Russians without thinking about the same dim-witted indifference of Americans. And I can't see the cowardice of Russian liberals without seeing my own cowardice. This, of course, isn't a coincidence. Putin's political technologists don't get their ideas from the ether. Like all professionals, they look for best practices among their peers. And when Putin was first starting out, no one was more ahead of the curve than Karl Rove and Roger Ailes. But I think there's a deeper reason for the similarities. Because fundamentally, the invasion of Iraq and the invasion of Ukraine were fought with the same goal in mind. Namely, destroying the liberal international order. The main thing the neoconservative movement spent the 90s seething about was how Bill Clinton constantly insisted on coalition building and consensus. Clinton had waited until he had Yeltsin's permission to expand NATO. Clinton had waited until the other European countries were on board to intervene in Bosnia. Clinton had waited for French permission to intervene in Rwanda, permission which never came because the French were supporting the Hutus. Towards the tail end of his presidency, Clinton was less patient, but even in the Kosovo War, the unilateral action was taken only after he spent 2 years begging for a multilateral effort, and only after he had gotten consensus with the French, Germans, British, and Italians. To neoconservatives, this represented a denial of the reality that America was metaphysically, ontologically good, rather than like any other country. And so, when they took power, they set out intentionally to undermine international organizations, international law, and consensus building as a principle, since in their minds these were all immoral constraints on America's unilateral power. Their first move to this end was to tear up the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. The second move was to pass the American Service Members Protection Act, a law that preemptively authorized the president to invade the Netherlands in the case any American was brought up before The Hague. And the American voters ate it all up. But the problem is, there are people outside the US, and they noticed. In 2003, 2004, they noticed that the US had gone completely insane. America's relationship with Europe collapsed. The Global South took it as proof that the US hadn't changed since the Vietnam era, and polls show America became widely seen as the most dangerous country on earth. In fact, in 2007, in Ukraine, yes, Ukraine, poll respondents said that the United States was the greatest threat to its national security. Not Russia, the United States. But there's an important difference between America in the 2000s and Russia today. America was a democracy, which means Americans could just elect a new president, reverse course, and pretend it never happened.
And even as we confront a vicious adversary that abides by no rules, I believe the United States of America must remain a standard bearer in the conduct of war. That is what makes us different from those whom we fight.
But the story can't end that tidily. People needed someone to blame, and they needed a way to distance themselves from the wars. In one sense, literally. Between 60 and 70% of the population supported the idea of invading Iraq before the war started. But years later, when Americans were asked to remember if they had supported the Iraq war back then, only about 30 to 40% say yes. But there was a more subtle rewriting of history about why the Iraq war happened. A narrative was created that there were really two different types of Iraq war supporters. One is the innocent masses who were fooled into supporting the wars through a massive propaganda campaign. And the other was the deep state, meaning a sort of consortium of big business and defense agencies that created the propaganda. The motive of the deep state in the story varies with the telling. Sometimes it's some corporate moneyed interest, sometimes it's naive idealism about spreading democracy, and sometimes it's the Jews, subordinating American interests to Israeli interests. The motive isn't as important as the faith that there is a shadowy elite that tricked us, and we would never have done something so stupid if not for them. In reality, the cause of the Iraq War is simpler. The American people are mostly racist, and they don't know enough geography to distinguish between places like Afghanistan or Pakistan or Iraq or Saudi Arabia. So when 9/11 happened, they held this vague brown people, Muslim, racial category collectively responsible, and they demanded a policy of collective punishment. And weak, sparsely populated Afghanistan just wasn't big enough to satisfy that urge. To quote Henry Kissinger,
after September 11th, the question for the United States has been, how can we make it clear to the region that challenging the United States has disastrous consequences, and therefore every government in the region, whether they were directly involved or not, must stop indirect support for these groups.
And so the Bush administration picked the most convenient country to make an example of. That's why public opinion on the war never changed from the start of 2002 to the start of the war, no matter how the media covered it. And that's how Wolfowitz sold it to Rumsfeld and Bush. Now, wars aren't monocausal, but that's the main cause. That was the oil that lubricated the gears of the war machine, not some secret plot. It was the politics of the lynch mob translated to foreign policy. And the foreign policy elite did not have any more sophisticated a view on this than the masses. I mean, here's the most influential liberal columnist in the country.
Now that the war is over, and there's some difficulty with the peace, was it worth doing?
Looking back, I now certainly feel I understand more what the war was about. The terrorism bubble that basically built up over the 1990s said, Flying airplanes into the World Trade Center, that's okay. Wrapping yourself with dynamite and blowing up Israelis in a pizza parlor, that's okay. Because we're weak and they're strong and the weak have a different morality. And having your press call people who do these kind of things martyrs, that's okay. And that built up as a bubble, Charlie. And 9/11 to me was the peak of that bubble. And what we learned on 9/11 in a gut way was that that bubble was a fundamental threat to our open society. And what we needed to do was go over to that part of the world, I'm afraid, and burst that bubble. We needed to go over there, basically, take out a very big stick, right in the heart of that world, and burst that bubble. Because part of that bubble said, we've got you. This bubble is actually going to level the balance of power between us and you because we don't care about life. We're ready to sacrifice, and all you care about are your stock options and your Hummers. And what they needed to see was American boys and girls going house to house from Basra to Baghdad, and basically saying, which part of this sentence don't you understand? You don't think, we care about our open society? You think this bubble fantasy, we're just going to let it grow? Well, suck on this. That, Charlie, was what this war was about. We could have hit Saudi Arabia. It was part of that bubble. Could have hit Pakistan. We hit Iraq because we could.
Everyone kind of knows this in their gut, but getting away from this stark, ugly truth is the core motivation of the new populist foreign policy analysis. Regardless of whether it's far-left populism or far-right populism or whatever the fuck the Quincy Institute is, it's a version of events that flatters the prejudices of everyone. The left liked it because the left uncritically accepts any theory that tells them that the workers all secretly agree with them. The right liked it because after the disaster, they needed a way to distance themselves from George Bush. And even the centrist pundits like this story because, isn't it a lot nicer to have everyone think you made an innocent mistake in the name of democracy rather than have them believe you joined in with a racist panic?
Are you upset with yourself about supporting that tactic and supporting that war?
Yeah, my criticism of myself would be that after 9/11, I overreacted. And I think as a country, we overreacted. And at the same time, I do feel, and this was the argument on Iraq, that unless we found a way to collaborate with people in that part of the world, to build a different kind of politics, to change the context in which people were able to grow up, realize their aspirations, live their lives, this problem was going to keep coming back, John, in one form or another.
And so everyone just sort of came to an agreement about how the Iraq War should be remembered. It was all the deep state's fault, and they bore no responsibility, regardless of whether or not they actually supported the war back then. There's just one small side effect of accepting this theory. It doesn't tell you what to do. It goes without saying that you can't trust the government or the experts since they're the people who lied to you. But for most people, you can't really do your own research because, you'd have to read books. So, what do? Well, most people just put their head in the sand. But for a special few, they've blindly put their trust in a sort of self-made foreign policy counter-elite. And by counter-elite, I of course mean grifters.
From 1946 until March 23rd, 1983, the strategic and foreign policies of the United States were steered by the influence of the most evil man of the 20th century, the late Bertrand Russell.
In the 1970s, as the country was shifting rapidly to the right and the radical left was cracking up, the leader of one small Trotskyist sect had an idea. The masses hated the new left, but perhaps one could still build a winning left-wing coalition by combining extreme social conservatism with left-wing economic populism and extreme state-led developmentalism. Basically, take everything that would appeal to a reactionary building trades union, and then just bind it all together into a coherent ideology. But how do you make all those ideas a coherent ideology? Well, by creating an elaborate, all-encompassing conspiracy theory of everything.
I know of no case of any attack on me which has been published or which I have noticed in the news media, which did not originate with either the drug lobby or with a Soviet operation, and sometimes the same thing.
This small ex-Trotskyist leader was named Lyndon LaRouche, and his conspiracy theory is a little hard to summarize, and it has changed a lot over the years, but the core of it has remained consistent enough that I can summarize it somewhat. So, get ready. The British royal family and a small cadre of English Fabian socialists, in conjunction with the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds, are engaged in a conspiracy to greatly reduce the population of the human race in order to head off a Malthusian catastrophe. A catastrophe that could easily be avoided by simply building a massive amount of nuclear power plants and a number of massive superhighways and bridges to connect all of the world's continents. But doing that would cut into the conspiracy's profits. So the British royal family invented environmentalism and neoliberalism in order to hide the truth. And in order to further reduce the population, the British royal family is also the world's foremost drug trafficking conspiracy. And it uses its control of the IMF to push austerity in order to kill as many people in the global south as possible. And also, Henry Kissinger is a gay KGB agent. Alright, we got it? That makes sense? Great. Maybe some of that sounded reasonable to you. Well, that's how they get you. Because the LaRouche movement is really a cult, not a political party. It hooks in idealistic young people who like one aspect of the movement, indoctrinates them in the whole insane complex, and makes them work incredibly long hours for free, calling people up and begging them for donations. And so LaRouche used all the money he got from the phone call operation and used it every 4 years to run for president.
Mondale is not simply a KGB agent in the ordinary sense, of course. Mondale is jointly owned by the left wing of the Socialist International and the grain cartel interests. If both these owners tell Mondale to lick the floor before a nationwide TV audience, I sincerely believe he would do just that.
Watch Lyndon LaRouche, Independent Democrat for President.
Those campaigns brought him to national prominence, and so LaRouche was brought onto mainstream media to explain himself, with hilarious results.
He's run for president 3 times, twice as a Democrat. Each time he's lost overwhelmingly. But he's not deterred by that.
The Democratic National Committee responded with a 50-state alert aimed at preventing more nominations of LaRouche-backed candidates pretending to be regular Democrats. The LaRouchians, calling themselves the National Democratic Policy Committee, claim to have 800 candidates running in primaries around the country this year.
What are you trying to do? You're running hundreds of candidates all over the country. What is your short-term goal?
I'm concerned with 2 things. I'm concerned with the collapse of Western civilization.
Were you ever a Marxist in your own opinion, ever?
I don't know.
Yes or no?
I don't know.
Mr. LaRouche, I want to quote you back to yourself. This is something I read on your stationery, written by you. Quote, according to authoritative sources, Henry A. Kissinger, that's our former Secretary of State, is not a Jew, but a f***. He is of the species some psychopathologists describe as an extreme anal variety of sadomasochistic personality. Has any psychopathologist ever suggested to you that you ought to be locked up?
And the rest of it because you think a Soviet attack against Germany is imminent.
It's sufficiently imminent that we have to assume it might occur at any time.
LaRouche says that the Israeli intelligence service is behind all terrorism. Do you believe that?
You say the B'nai B'rith founded the Ku Klux Klan, or funded it.
No.
You had signs this morning saying NBC killed Olof Palme of Sweden. What the hell does that mean?
With us to discuss the 1988 presidential campaign is political nutcase Lyndon LaRouche. Hi, Lyndon.
In America, LaRouche became something of a joke.
Bush, a former member of the Satanic Trilateral Commission, is a known co-conspirator of the homosexual child molester Henry Kissinger.
Bioduplication, nude conspiracies. Oh my God, Lyndon LaRouche was right.
But around the world, he was building another source of power. LaRouche reinvented himself as an intelligence dealer, publishing a weekly magazine that used his intelligence connections to publish stories about what was really going on in the world. And he had real connections. By the early 80s, he was taking meetings with the CIA. But he was also being investigated by the FBI. And it didn't take long for the FBI to discover that the LaRouche organization was making fraudulent charges with people's credit card numbers.
Federal agents found what they wanted yesterday in a raid on the headquarters of political extremist Lyndon LaRouche.
Now that LaRouche could no longer live in America, he moved to Germany to live with his second wife, Helga Zepp LaRouche, where he formed a new organization called the Schiller Institute, and formed connections in various European countries, including Russia, a country he had previously been trying to get nude.
The Russians are irrationalists. They're racists.
They're Russian racists. Great Russian racists. If you don't believe it, ask a Ukrainian.
He continued publishing his Intelligence magazine in Europe, and he picked up a few new writers, the most important of which is F. William Engdahl.
Well, William Engdahl's on the line. He's a geopolitical analyst, author of Myths, Lies, and Oil Wars.
The Greek crisis was programmed to be detonated at command by Wall Street and the U.S. Treasury, as well as the Federal Reserve, in order to defend the reserve currency role of the U.S. dollar.
You probably haven't heard of William Engdahl, but you might have heard of some of the conspiracy theories he's invented. For instance, the theory that Bill Gates is trying to sterilize the human race using vaccines. William Engdahl invented that theory in 2009. But that's not his most important theory. In the 90s, EIR started focusing on a Jewish hedge fund manager named George Soros. This culminated in a feature by Engdahl about how Soros was secretly using a small network of NGOs to overthrow governments on behalf of the Rothschilds, and that through these NGOs he had caused all the revolutions of 1989 that had overthrown the communist states of Eastern Europe. He did this, allegedly, in order to introduce shock therapy and destroy them. This theory didn't make much of a splash at the time, and would have been forgotten if not for a movement developing on the American left. Because one small subsection of the left, for reasons that are too complicated to get into here, had become obsessed with proving the innocence of Serbian dictator Slobodan Milosevic. And this section of the left was naturally caught off guard when, after a ham-handed attempt at rigging the 2000 election, Milosevic decided to step down in the face of massive protests, after which he was immediately handed over to The Hague for prosecution, an outcome even his opponents in the West had completely given up on. So this section of the left was naturally distraught and latched onto the theory created by the LaRouche movement that George Soros had organized the overthrow of Milosevic, just like he had organized the overthrow of the Eastern European communist governments. But since this was now appearing in left-wing publications, instead of Soros being a tool of the Rothschilds, he became a tool of the CIA. But one of the writers for these left-wing magazines, a Canadian economist named Michel Chossudovsky, decided to create his own publication. Probably because other magazines wouldn't publish his 9/11 Truth articles. He quickly hired William Engdahl, along with a raft of other conspiracy theorists, to publish for his think tank, the Center for Research on Globalization, or Global Research for short. And this website would go on to a lucrative partnership with the Russian government.
It's called Global Research, a website offering audiences a wide range of conspiracy theories, often in line with what experts consider Russian government narratives.
Depicting COVID-19 as a dangerous virus. That's the basis of the fear campaign.
That's Michel Chossudovsky, the website's listed editor. The retired professor wouldn't answer questions about any links to Russia, but he denied running a Kremlin-aligned disinformation site.
Hold on. We're getting ahead of ourselves. First, cut to 2003. In the country of Georgia, where Georgian President Eduard Shevardnadze is being ousted by his own protege, a man named Mikhail Saakashvili. It didn't make many waves in Russia, mainly because Putin hated Shevardnadze and was glad to see him gone. But it did capture the attention of some Westerners, because some of the people who had helped push out Shevardnadze had been NGOs funded by one George Soros. So their old Milosevic theory suddenly was vindicated. LaRouche accused Soros of working for the Rockefellers, the left accused Soros of working for the CIA, and even the neoconservatives at the Weekly Standard accused Soros of supporting Saakashvili in order to undermine George Bush, because Shevardnadze had been such a good American ally. But none of this theorizing made it into Russia until a year later, when something happened in Ukraine.
Мой отъезд из Киева носил довольно смешной характер, поскольку я жил в гостинице прямо в центре Киева, то есть, собственно говоря, в самом центре толпы оранжевой. Я вынужден был переодеться. Я в оранжевом шарфе и в оранжевой вязаной шапочке.
This is Gleb Pavlovsky. In the early 2000s, Gleb Pavlovsky was Russia's most important political technologist. He had been the main architect of Putin's public image since Yeltsin had chosen him as his successor. And now he had been given a $600 million budget to elect Viktor Yanukovych president of Ukraine. His campaign hit familiar themes. the opposition were Nazis, the opposition would divide the country, the opposition would ban the Russian language, the opposition would ban the Orthodox Church. But it didn't work. So when Pavlovsky went back home to Russia, he would need a good excuse to cover for his failure. And wouldn't you know, there's this pre-made one lying around courtesy of the West. Pavlovsky exclaimed to audiences back in Russia that the 2000 overthrow of Milosevic and the 2003 overthrow of Shevardnadze had in fact, like the Orange Revolution, been organized by the West, using a secret set of technology and tactics invented by the CIA. Small youth group performance art pieces, and mass protests. See, during the late 90s, a small protest group had emerged in Serbia called Otpor, led by a man named Sergej Popovic. It had organized multiple anti-government protests, usually with a sort of comic, theatrical edge. And, not coincidentally, Milosevic was toppled in 2000 after trying to rig his re-election. This success made the leaders of Otpor celebrities, and Popovic became a sort of anti-dictator protest consultant. Popovic in turn gave credit to one of the books he had read during the protests. From Dictatorship to Democracy by Gene Sharp, an American pacifist who had tried to develop a theory of nonviolent revolution. But about a year later, it was revealed that Otpor had gotten a few $1 million from the National Endowment for Democracy, a small NGO founded by Congress during the Reagan administration to put a friendlier gloss on Reagan's hyper-aggressive foreign policy. That policy of funding Otpor was championed in America by, ironically, anti-war activists, who were hoping to use Popovic's success in overthrowing Milosevic as proof that Clinton's decision to bomb Serbia had actually been pointless and counterproductive, and that he should have used pacifist measures. So, with the Americans hyping up their own inflated role in the bulldozer revolution, Pavlovsky got an idea. Maybe the CIA has been training government overthrow performance art youth groups in all of the Eastern European countries, using Gene Sharp as the mastermind, Sergej Popovic as a cutout, and using George Soros and the National Endowment for Democracy as a funding mechanism. Through those groups, the CIA overthrew Milosevic, Shevardnadze, and now Viktor Yanukovych. And a month into 2005, a new revolution in Kyrgyzstan called the Tulip Revolution was also blamed on it. And according to Pavlovsky, Moldova, Belarus, and Russia itself were the next targets. And so Putin should give him more money to create a sort of preventive counter-revolution. These four revolutions Pavlovsky is talking about, Bulldozer Revolution, the Rose Revolution, the Tulip Revolution, and the Orange Revolution, came to be known as the Color Revolutions. Now you might ask, why is that? Only one of them is named after a color. The fact that they're called color revolutions actually turns out to be a telling clue of why so many people will latch onto an anti-Semitic red-brown conspiracy theory invented by a cult and adopted opportunistically by a dictator.
And it's a good thing that the men and women across the Middle East looking to Iraq are getting a glimpse of what life in a free country can be like.
Around the same time as the Orange Revolution, Bush's war in Iraq was spinning out of control into a bloodbath. So Bush tried to salvage the reputation of his Middle East policy by tying it to the idea of democracy promotion.
In recent times, we have witnessed landmark events in the history of liberty. A Rose Revolution in Georgia, an Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and now a Purple Revolution in Iraq.
The Iraq War had never really been about WMDs or terrorism, it had been about democracy. And since Iraq was about democracy promotion, in a sense, it had been the inspiration for the revolutions in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So, when you think about it, really the Iraq War was a success, even as the country slipped into civil war, because the war had sent democracy vibes to Ukraine. Soon, Bush's cheerleaders in the media even started calling the Iraqi elections the Purple Revolution, to match with the Orange Revolution. And so, the name Color Revolution stuck. There was only one person on Earth who could have fallen for this spin. Unfortunately, that man was also in Bratislava.
Мы не собираемся придумывать никакой своеобразной российской демократии. При этом, разумеется, все эти современные институты демократии должны быть адекватны сегодняшнему развитию российского общества, нашей истории и нашим традициям.
Who immediately became convinced that Pavlovsky was right, and Bush now must be angling to overthrow him. so he put his political technologists to work trying to prevent one. To that end, the Russian government started making contacts with the conspiracy theorists at Global Research, including William Engdahl, who in turn wrote a book called Full Spectrum Dominance, which synthesized the LaRouche conspiracy theory of revolutions with the pro-Milosevic Trotskyist conspiracy theory of revolutions and the Kremlin's theory of revolutions into one almost coherent narrative. That narrative goes something like this. A formless, unknowable deep state in the American government using the Bush administration, the National Endowment for Democracy, George Soros, Sergei Popovich, Gene Sharp, and USAID has the ability to create mass protests on demand, and is using this power to overthrow every government in Eurasia that's standing in the way of America's ambition to monopolize control over Central Asian oil pipelines, namely the critical Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. If any of that sounds familiar, it's just because he replaced the British royal family part of the LaRouche theory with the villain plot from James Bond's The World Is Not Enough. The first country to take up this theory after Russia was Venezuela, specifically its leader, Hugo Chavez.
Con este letrero, ojo pelao, el plan imperial. Esta es la tesis de Gene Sharp a la que me he referido.
The second was Iran, which made a helpful instructional video starring NPCs from Sonic 06.
جورج سوروس سرمایه‌دار یهودی است که سردمدار استعمار فرانوین میباشد. جین شارپ نظریه پرداز نافرمانی مدنی جان مکین از مسئولین کاخ سفید که توطئه‌های متعددی را علیه جمهوری اسلامی ایران.
So let's pause here to ask, is color revolution theory true? Well, I can poke a few holes into it. For one, Otpor wasn't really responsible for Milosevic's overthrow. Otpor had been at work for years in Serbia with no progress. What changed in 2000 is A, the trade unions in the provinces who had previously supported Slobodan Milosevic turned against him. B, Bill Clinton had gone to Russia and asked the newly elected president to put more pressure on Milosevic to step down. And C, the massive sanctions campaign that was grinding Serbia's economy to a halt. Problem 2, the Rose and Orange revolutions weren't really revolutions at all. Sure, the mass protest helped put pressure on their respective dictators, but ultimately both crises were resolved by backroom deals between political elites. Problem 3 was the lack of motivation. Saakashvili and Shevardnadze just didn't have very different foreign policies. Problem 4 is that color revolutions only happen to corrupt democracies. Regular dictators can fare them just fine. You just throw all the protesters in jail and ban the NGOs, which makes them pretty useless for regime change since they can pretty much only hit leaders who don't have a consolidated regime. Problem 5 is that the amount of money actually being given to these NGOs is usually in the mid-six-figure range, which is enough for like 2 staff salaries and an office space. And they're operating in countries where every TV station is controlled by the government. So, aside from the fact that there was no motive for America in half of these countries, the fact that half of them involved leaders voluntarily stepping down, and the fact that the idea that you can overthrow a government on a $2 million budget is just an inherently silly idea, it makes perfect sense. So it's probably no surprise the color revolutions Putin dreaded just never came. Putin's real problem was succession. Russia had term limits, which meant Putin would either have to alter the constitution or step down. So he stepped down and chose a hand-picked weak successor named Dmitry Medvedev. And just like Yeltsin had done for Putin, Putin started a war in the Caucasus and let Medvedev lead it so he could look like a hero.
Признателен мне, что в какой-то момент я просто остановил войска. Если бы они вошли в Тбилиси, то, скорее всего, в настоящий момент в Грузии был бы другой президент.
You're hard, showing off.
And this worked. Russia had a peaceful transition of power with no color revolutions. And relations with the West even warmed up. Maybe a little too fast given he had just blown up a sovereign country, but otherwise things seemed to be going well. And in Russia, fears of a color revolution started to fade. But the theory about color revolutions found a new champion in America.
And I told you that there was a structure being put into place in our country, and it was designed to bring about the fundamental transformation that has been promised. Through the course of this journey of discovery, amazingly, all the paths, time after time, really led to one man, George Soros.
In 2004, George Soros had become the target of a massive smear campaign from the neoconservative movement after he had publicly opposed the Iraq War and donated a large sum of money to John Kerry's campaign.
Well, and I guess this is why you can be a polarizing figure, Mr. Soros. You say the war on terror, as we have waged it since 9/11, has done more harm than good. Yes. It's pretty strong.
This produced a book called The Shadow Party by David Horowitz and Richard Poe, in which they talked about how George Soros had caused every world revolution in the past 20 years, and how he was now coming for America. And you'll never guess who their source was. This book then inspired a 2-hour-long TV segment by Fox News.
Soros has helped fund the Velvet Revolution in the Czech Republic, the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine, the Rose Revolution in Georgia.
The text is almost verbatim from what you could see in Russian propaganda a few years later.
Step 1, you form a shadow government. He's done that. Infiltrate the target country using humanitarian aid. You control the airwaves. This is his media empire. NPR, free press. You cause a political or economic crisis, or you take advantage of an existing crisis. You wait for an election, and then you cry voter fraud. Step 5, stage massive demonstrations, and you accuse opponents of voter fraud through radio and TV stations that you control.
Now, I should make clear for my non-American viewers, this man had the highest rated cable news show in 2010. He was widely considered the single most influential pundit in America. This is despite the fact that, he's insane.
You are watching the beginning and the birth of the New World Order. And you want to call me crazy? Go to hell.
And now he was making color revolution theory mainstream, just in time for the Arab Spring.
When we started to do our homework on this, we found that the State Department has worked with Google and youth groups.
And what does the State Department want to accomplish through Google?
The revolution in Egypt. That's what they were working on, the revolution.
They wanted Mubarak out of there.
Yes.
Beck was convinced that a shadowy cabal of American Fabian socialists had used their control of Google to overthrow the Egyptian government somehow.
It is not pro-democracy. Now, maybe it is for some. I mean, the people have been abused by a brutal dictator. That is true. And I stand with the people of Egypt. But they're being played.
And Glenn Beck was not alone. According to basically any official in the State Department who has ever had to mediate between Obama and Putin, Vladimir Putin is 100% convinced that the Arab Spring was organized by Obama and the CIA as a color revolution.
For Putin, the Arab Spring and the revolutions and upheavals that unfolded from the beginning of 2011 on were of a piece with the color revolutions in the former Soviet Union.
The Arab Spring, which had increased his paranoia about America's role in fomenting revolution abroad.
I was on lots of these phone calls with Obama and Putin in the late Obama years, where Putin would always say that your policy is regime change. Yes. And Obama would be like, no, it's not. And Putin believes, or at least says that he believes that U.S. policy is regime change, and he has said that for a very long time.
He accused Hillary Clinton of trying to topple his government in 2012.
Because she issued a written statement. Think about right. the parliamentary elections, right?
Man, we are not that good. We are not that good. I even told Russian television once when they were accusing me personally of being the gray cardinal of the color revolutions, I said, I wish. How come you see America with a massive budget being unable to do anything much to stop the political deterioration and security deterioration in Iraq, and you think on no budget at all we can overthrow Moscow-supported governments in Kyiv and Tbilisi? Are you kidding me? But they really thought we were doing it.
It's hard to say who convinced him of this, but it's worth noting all the conspiracy theorists at Global Research I was talking about earlier had already gotten jobs with the Russian government by the time the Arab Spring had started. And many of them were already working at Russian-funded think tanks with people like Alexander Dugin. We know for sure one person who didn't convince Putin of this theory, though, is Dmitry Medvedev, because Medvedev had given Obama permission to start the war in Libya, a decision that infuriated Putin and convinced him Medvedev couldn't be trusted with running the government anymore. So they had a little private chat, and suddenly Medvedev had something to announce.
Съезд поддержал кандидатуру председателя партии Владимира Путина на должность президента страны.
And this is where things all start to go downhill.
Prime Minister Putin announced he would run for a third term as president next year, switching jobs yet again with the current president, Dmitry Medvedev. In response, Finance Minister Alexei Kudrin resigned, and criticism swelled on Russian internet sites. Then last month, Putin was booed by spectators at a martial arts event in Moscow. A rare display of public disapproval captured on this amateur video.
Because Russia's stability hadn't been built on some magical propaganda technique. It had been built on a belief among a large number of Russians that Russia was basically moving in the right direction. The country might not have been a democracy, but it was getting there, just at its own pace. Putin's return felt like a step backwards, and Putin, by stepping down in the first place, had punctured the myth of his own indispensability. So when the government was caught defrauding the parliamentary elections that same year, people used it as an opportunity to have their say.
This video, posted on YouTube, purported to show ballots that had been filled out ahead of the actual voting. Anger boiled into the streets last week, with several protests that brought a heavy show of force by police and large numbers of arrests.
These protests were mostly ignored in the West, and even when the media did pay attention, they were more than a little dismissive.
Tonight's crowds were not huge.
Who are the people in the streets? Is this just a phenomenon of the kind of urban Twitterati?
In what is not a crisis for Putin's Russia, but a new kind of challenge nonetheless.
No one in the West saw the makings of a revolution, but Putin did. He was sure. The color revolution had come for him. Even worse, he became convinced that the moderates in his administration, including Medvedev, were in on it. So history would have to be rewritten. State TV ran a documentary expose in which Russian generals confessed that in 2008, Dmitry Medvedev had been a massive coward and had in fact almost botched and lost the war with Georgia, somehow. And that the war was only saved by secret orders issued by Vladimir Putin behind the scenes. Then Putin fired all his moderate advisors and surrounded himself with his old KGB friends and filled a bunch of cabinet posts with wacky far-right nationalists. Then he created a massive paramilitary force answerable directly to him and run by his own personal security guard. Putin also radically changed his approach to domestic politics. Instead of depicting himself as the man who brought law and order to Russia and allowed it to modernize, Putin made modernity itself the enemy. He was now the defender of traditional values against modernity, which was now an artificial American construct, and that the attempt to modernize Russia forced on it by the Americans is what had caused the chaos of the 90s. This idea about what caused the 90s might seem like a small abstract distinction, but it actually changed a lot. Putin had turned the 90s from something bad in Russia's past into an ever-present threat, something America was chomping at the bit to impose on Russia and would again if not for Vladimir Putin. The country was now on a permanent Cold War footing, but it would take several years for America to notice.
A few months ago, when you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia. Not Al-Qaeda, you said Russia. In the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back.
This also rewrote Russia's relationship with Europe. Before the protests, Putin saw the EU as an opportunity to pry Europe away from America, especially during the Bush years. But Obama had repaired the relationship with Europe to such an extent that it seemed hopeless, and the EU had, like the State Department, been mildly critical of Russia for rigging its elections. So the EU was written off as an irredeemable puppet of the United States. And this was a big problem for a certain president of Ukraine. Viktor Yanukovych had built his entire foreign policy around pushing America away and pulling Europe closer, as a way of balancing between East and West. But now, suddenly Russia decides Europe is the enemy. And now Yanukovych has no way to balance between the demands of his people and the demands of the Kremlin. Maybe something could have been worked out if Russia's policy towards Ukraine had been handled by a deft diplomatic hand. Instead, it was being handled by this man, Sergei Glazyev. Sergei Glazyev started out in the early 90s as a reformist economist for Boris Yeltsin, but after being pushed out on corruption charges, he went crazy and became an anti-Semitic ultranationalist. In 2004, he was put in charge of the far-right party Rodina. Then, when Putin purged the government of Medvedev supporters in 2011, he was brought into the government proper. One other fun fact about Sergei Glazyev.
This year, progressive people around the world are observing the centenary of the birth of the brilliant thinker, and I wouldn't hesitate to say prophet of our time, Lyndon LaRouche.
He is the leading member of the Lyndon LaRouche movement in Russia. Through the LaRouche organization, he made his name as a nationalist politician by publishing a book accusing the same Anglo-Jewish conspiracy of intentionally causing a genocide in Russia. And Putin had put him in charge of Eurasian integration, that is to say, creating an alternative to the EU and getting Ukraine into it. This meant that Russia's relationship with Ukraine was in the hands of a man who believes genocidal Jewish bankers run the EU. So as Yanukovych negotiated with Europe, Glazyev became the face of the movement to keep Ukraine out of the EU, making regular appearances on Ukrainian TV and at conferences. It was Glazyev who threatened Ukraine with war even before the Maidan started. And it was Glazyev who wrote most of the propaganda script that Russian media would use in response to the protests. That pro-EU Ukrainians were in fact all gay Nazi CIA agents. This all pushed the Ukrainian people even more towards Europe. By January, Yanukovych was trapped. He had tried to break up the protests with force, and they got bigger. He had the Russians breathing down his neck, telling him to use more force or else they would take back their $15 billion. And he had Joe Biden in his office telling him that if he did shoot protesters, America would sanction the hell out of the country. So he tries to make a deal. If the opposition helps quell the protesters, he'll give 2 of the opposition leaders ministerial portfolios. The opposition is skeptical of this offer, so they take it to the American embassy and ask for advice. And the Americans tell them to take the deal, but with one condition.
I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
And here's probably the moment some of you are waiting for. The Nuland phone call. So what's going on here? Victoria Nuland, the Deputy Secretary of State, probably correctly thinks this offer is a trap. Nuland doesn't want Klitschko to go into the government because if both Yatsenyuk and Klitschko went into the government at the same time, that would leave on the street only Oleg Tyanibok, who, you will recall from earlier videos, is a Nazi. Leaving Tyanibok in the street would turn him into the sole face of the movement.
In terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tyanibok and his guys. And, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
Which would radicalize it and scare off the normies. Now, that would reduce the movement's mass appeal, but would also dangerously polarize the country even more. A risk Yanukovych was willing to take because he saw it as the only way to keep himself in power. Now, Yatsenyuk had experience dealing with Yanukovych as his foreign minister, so he was the most likely to survive any sort of bureaucratic warfare that Yanukovych would engage against him. Klitschko had 0 political experience, so Nuland wanted Klitschko to swallow his pride and stay on the street.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience.
Yatsenyuk and Klitschko instead rejected Nuland's idea and just scrapped the deal altogether, so the violence continued. Now, of course, the reason we know this is because the phone call was recorded by the FSB and leaked. But the fact that the phone call was leaked tells us something else very important. The Kremlin was more afraid of Yanukovych making a deal with the opposition than it was of Yanukovych being overthrown. After all, why else try to scuttle a deal that would have kept Yanukovych in power, unless they were already convinced Yanukovych was going to backstab them? Now, this might be why the Kremlin wasn't just in contact with Yanukovych, but also directly in contact with Yanukovych's underlings. Either way, it was clear Yanukovych didn't control his security services.
When the protesters charged up the hill, the police opened fire with automatic rifles, and now we're seeing many protesters coming back badly injured.
His interior minister, the chief of all federal law enforcement, had ghosted him and was not answering his calls. All his lieutenants had disappeared with him. So the marooned police forces in the middle of the protest just had to surrender in exchange for safe passage out of the city. This left Yanukovych with no police force loyal to him left in the entire capital. So, naturally, Yanukovych makes a run for it. And we all know how Russia responded.
Russian President Vladimir Putin made his first visit since Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine.
After taking Crimea, Russia knew they had lit the fuse on a divided, unstable Ukraine. So all they had to do was wait for Ukraine to dissolve into a civil war so that they could move in and mop it up. So they waited. And waited. And waited. And when there weren't any uprisings, Glaziev tried to organize them. For 6 weeks, Glaziev paid protesters to attack government buildings and stir up riots. But the central government simply ignored them, and so did most of the locals. The civil war and breakup of Ukraine was just not going to happen on its own. This, perhaps, should have been a sign that color revolution theory was wrong, and you cannot, in fact, overthrow a government by giving a few $1,000s to NGOs. After all, Russia had followed all the steps it had accused America of following precisely. It paid protesters. It sent agent provocateurs. It sent mobs to take over government buildings. It engaged in street theater. It broadcasted fake news about how the Banderites were coming to kill everyone. And normal life just hummed along. Instead, Glaziev took it as a sign that the gay Anglo-Jewish Nazi CIA was working even harder behind the scenes to keep Ukraine stable. After all, he had that phone call.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week.
Look, she said Yats is the guy. And Yatsenyuk did get appointed prime minister for the interim government. I mean, what are the chances of that happening coincidentally? How often does the leader of the biggest opposition party gain power after the opposition party takes control of the government? Had to be the CIA. This cycle of escalation in response to an imaginary American escalation would continue into August, by which point hundreds of people would be dead. And at the same time Glaziev was trying to organize a color revolution, the Russian Ministry of Defense was putting out a massive PR campaign.
Russia's defense establishment holds a conference each year to discuss the most pressing security issues that face the region. This year's conference was originally scheduled to focus on what would happen in Central Asia once the United States withdraws from Afghanistan. But Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu changed all that with an opening speech in which he said that major threats to peace today are the so-called color revolutions. According to this view, color revolutions would include the Arab Spring revolts in Egypt, Libya, and Syria, and of course the latest revolution in Ukraine.
Putin rebranded himself one more time. Instead of being a protector of Russia from American aggression, he was a global messiah sent to protect the whole world from Barack Obama's massive global regime change rampage, which at this point in his estimation had caused wars in Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, Yemen, and now Ukraine. And here Russia found astronomical success. Both the left-wing press and the right-wing press in the West followed Russia's lead. And not just fringy publications either this time. Mainstream publications. Respected IR scholars, Harvard economists, rock stars. Lots of people were eager to rewrite history to make the Arab Spring and the Ukraine War a CIA operation.
The third part of the story is fostering an orange revolution. This is all about promoting democracy. As you all know, the United States runs around the world trying to topple regimes and put in their place democratically elected regimes.
Globalists, Zionists, the European Union, they're not in the least bit interested in Ukrainian freedom. They're interested in using Ukrainian nationalism as a way of attacking Russia.
And it's a Libya that no longer has a strongman who, in his own small way, was actually willing to challenge the Washington consensus.
And who better to push your theory that the Maidan was run by gay Nazi CIA agents than the famous Hollywood movie director who won 2 Oscars for his movie about how JFK was murdered by gay Nazi CIA agents. Soon, dedicated journalism outfits were created specifically to prove everything was a color revolution. The protest in Belarus, the protest in Kazakhstan. The Chinese blamed protests in Hong Kong on it. YouTubers call small LGBT protests in Vietnam color revolutions. Anti-royalist protests in Thailand are called color revolutions. Hungary accused George Soros of leading a Jewish plot to destroy Christian values in Europe through color revolutions, and was joined by Israel, who accused George Soros of leading an anti-Semitic plot to destroy Israeli values with color revolutions. And in 2020, we hit peak insanity, with an accusation from William Engdahl himself that the George Floyd protests were a color revolution fomented by the American government to overthrow itself. As the years went on, more and more people would become convinced of the theory that the CIA and George Soros had organized every protest in the world since 1989. I once saw someone called the 1905 Russian Revolution a color revolution. Russia's propaganda campaign on this front has been so successful that Washington began treating it as a national security threat, desperately trying to pin down the alchemy that made it work. And the 2016 election only made that paranoia 10 times worse. But Russia's influence on this front wouldn't stop growing until February 2022, when they finally told a lie too big to ignore. But back in 2014, Americans weren't really paying attention to Ukraine. The real target of the anti-Ukrainian propaganda back then was Europe, where they made major breakthroughs. And this was a problem for Barack Obama, because Barack Obama's strategy for punishing Russia relied on using Europe to put economic pressure on Russia, and Europe wasn't obliging. So Obama went to Brussels and gave a big speech trying to convince the Europeans that, maybe it would be a good idea for Europeans to care about European security.
To be honest, if we define our interests narrowly, if we applied a cold-hearted calculus, we might decide to look the other way. Our economy is not deeply integrated with Ukraine's. Our people and our homeland face no direct threat from the invasion of Crimea. Our own borders are not threatened by Russia's annexation. But that kind of casual indifference would ignore the lessons that are written in the cemeteries of this continent.
He also, in a moment that surely went over most people's heads, made a point of explicitly denying color revolution theory.
It's not America that filled the Maidan with protesters. It was Ukrainians. No foreign forces compelled the citizens of Tunis and Tripoli to rise up. They did so on their own.
It is a surprisingly good speech.
Do not think for a moment that your own freedom, your own prosperity, that your own moral imagination is bound by the limits of your community, your ethnicity, or even your country. You're bigger than that.
Of course, it didn't work. So Obama decided to settle not for rolling back Russia, but instead making an example of Russia, setting the precedent that maybe America wouldn't bomb you if you invaded your neighbor, but they would make sure you'd have at least a massive recession, and hope that was enough deterrence for everyone else. Russia started running into problems in July. You see, the problem with hybrid warfare, as Russia's tactics came to be known, is that it is a recreation of a conspiracy theory that only exists in fantasy. So the tactics don't actually work, and by August, the Ukrainian army was on the verge of winning the war. Putin, now caught in a bind between starting a conventional war he didn't want and taking an L, decided to send in the ground troops, fired Glazyev and put the Ministry of Defense in charge of the war, had all the charismatic warlords of the Donbass assassinated and replaced with people who would follow orders, and tried to get the Ukrainians to give up European integration at the negotiating table. But Putin still couldn't get what he wanted. To Ukraine, Putin's demand that Ukraine economically integrate with Russia instead of Europe was tantamount to a demand that Ukraine stay poor forever. Even setting aside the principle of the thing, they'd rather just keep fighting the war. Putin, being both economically illiterate and racist against Ukrainians, just couldn't grok this, and continued to blame the US. And his conspiracy-brained advisors and propagandists continued to cheer him on. The nationalists were unhappy with him because they wanted him to invade all of Ukraine, and the liberals were unhappy with him because American sanctions had damaged the economy. To quote Alexander Dugin,
Crimea was the culmination point, the last stop before changing absolutely the logic of the development of modern Russia. But it didn't happen. I don't know why. It was a betrayal. For the patriotic group, it was a betrayal by Putin of our awakening. And for liberals, it was a betrayal by Putin of globalist rules. So Putin has betrayed both parties. And it is the worst that could possibly happen, because we've committed half the crime, but paid the full price.
Backed into a corner, surrounded by yes men, facing a ticking clock and slowly going insane under COVID lockdown, Putin decided to cut the Gordian knot and prove once and for all that Ukrainian democracy was a Potemkin village. And you know the rest.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. And a little bit of chicken fried. Cold beer on a Friday
just right. And the radio. Get 5 bonus wings for $1.
Ты не уж как Югославию, Америке. Мы стаем без боя кровную родиню. И летает братский сос над русским берегом.
In August of 2014, as the war was heating up, the Russian ultranationalist militias decided to throw a party for themselves. A celebratory bike show in newly annexed Crimea. This bike show also included a poetry reading, interpretive dance, rock opera version of the war in Ukraine, as they imagined it. They spared no expense, and I recommend everyone go and watch this video because it's one of the better views you can get into the mindset of the type of people who started this war, like a sort of Putin-themed Psychonauts level. Defenseless riot cops are terrorized by Ukrainian Nazis, while the giant wire mesh hands of Uncle Sam pull their puppet strings. A drumline of blood-vomiting bikers stand at attention in front of the eye pyramid of the New World Order, while speeches of Barack Obama and Adolf Hitler spliced together are played over the loudspeaker. All while the leader of a motorcycle gang that simultaneously venerates both Joseph Stalin and Tsar Nicholas as saints reads anti-Semitic poetry about how this war is the culmination of Stalin's dream. In 1993, Yeltsin was having people like this gunned down in the street. In the late 90s, they were tolerated but still politically marginalized. By the mid-2000s, they had been made part of the systemic opposition. By 2012, they were exercising real political power. And now, here they are, in 2014, with the backing of the president, on national state television, in front of a crowd of hundreds of thousands, dancing in a swastika formation to Hans Zimmer Batman music. There are people who see this progression and think it was inevitable, that this is the expression of the real Russia, but all I can see are the contingencies, the stupid contingencies. I didn't make these videos to prove to you that Russia is imperialist and therefore bad. I made them to prove that the Russians are stupid. They're inept imperialists. Because the stupidity is the tragedy here. Imperialism is rational, if not good. So it's somewhat inevitable in a world with strong countries and weak countries. But this was a waste. Anyone who tells you Alexei Navalny or whoever is just as bad as Putin because he's just a smarter, subtler nationalist is greatly underestimating the destructive capacity of stupidity. But it's not just Russia. Last year, after the war started, the network of pro-Kremlin conspiracy theorists we've been talking about had their own rally in Washington.
The neocons that have seamlessly shifted from administration to administration, they are fully in control and they imperil humanity.
We have the lie that one fine morning, President Vladimir Putin woke up and said, "Gee, I feel like invading Ukraine today."
The difference between our government these days and the mafia in the 1940s, well, the mafia in the 1940s helped defeat the Nazis.
Then we had the assassination of our president, John F. Kennedy, and the lie of the magic bullet.
U.S. imperial aims are clearly stated in our official military policy known as full spectrum dominance.
And did I mention that all wars are bankers' wars? Let me hear you say it. All wars are bankers' wars.
The roofs are dripping with the blood of those Ukrainian soldiers. And if you listen closely, you can hear it right now.
Then we had 9/11, allegedly perpetrated by some guy suffering kidney failure.
And they're standing there looking at me like I'm fucking crazy.
It was less flashy, but it hit on a lot of the same notes as the bike show.
We've been smeared as, quote, not anti-war. Well, let's not confuse being anti-war with pacifism. Any leader, any people would defend themselves as Russia is today. War is hell, but blaming both sides obfuscates reality.
Just like the bike show was a celebration of the fusion of Russia's communist and Tsarist pasts, so too the rage against the war machine was a celebration of the fusion of far right and far left.
Look at all of you. You're beautiful. You're beautiful. We got leftists, we got communists, right-wingers, conservatives, paleo-conservatives, libertarians, Greens, People Party.
If Black Panthers can march hand in hand with the KKK down Las Vegas Boulevard to get welfare payments reinstated. We can join hands with the right wing, the libertarians, the left, the socialists, the communists, everybody to stop a nuclear war.
We can debate whether or not teenage girls should have to share locker rooms or compete in athletics against biological males another time.
And I just want to say, in my experience, it's not so much a matter of right or left. It's really a question of the few elites at the top versus all the rest of us.
See? Neither right nor left, just against the secret cabal of bankers that are responsible for all the wars. These people are a joke, but their stupid ideas have effectively drowned out any meaningful discussion in alternative media. So the world is now polarized between this.
We have to understand that the COVID-19 response, lockdowns, and experimental injections were deadly war measures imposed against us by the Pentagon
And the State Department. The result is a sort of reverse McCarthyism. If you dissent from their very narrow vision of how the world works, you're accused of secretly being loyal to the United States. A narrative has been created that these people, whatever you want to call them, Vatniks, free thinkers, tankies, trolls, the horseshoe left, the horseshoe right, populists, are a tool of Russian foreign policy. That the Russian government is telling these people what to say. But as we've seen, the flow of disinformation has mostly gone the other way. Putin has been fooled as much as he's fooled others. And what this war has cleared up, at least for me, is that there is no master plan. Forget the myths the media has created about the Kremlin. The truth all along was that these are not bright guys, and things just got out of hand. And that's it. That's the cause of the war in Ukraine. It really is just a case of Russia defending itself. It's just a defense against shadows and ghosts. That's why Putin has been and will be both impossible to appease and impossible to deter. And that's why there won't be a deal. The Russian ruling class just has to be allowed to self-immolate until living in the real world finally becomes preferable again. But that means understanding the war doesn't mean understanding Putin or the real geopolitics. It means understanding the mass hysteria that has sprung up around these incredibly dumb conspiracy theories and the grifters who profit from them. So why has this dumb conspiracy theory taken the world by storm? The pat answer has been to blame the internet. And while the internet does drive people crazy, it does so by reinforcing things people already wanted to believe. It doesn't tell you why people wanted to believe those things in the first place. And I think the timing here may be key. I don't think it's a coincidence that a conspiracy theory aiming to explain why all revolutions are fake took off in the 2010s. After all, the 2010s were first and foremost a decade of failed revolutions. Failed revolutions generate two types of people: paranoid reactionaries and disappointed revolutionaries. People eager to make bottom-up political change impossible, and people eager to believe bottom-up change is impossible, as an excuse for their own failures. And the Arab Spring added a third group: guilty bystanders. People think the Iraq War discredited the idea of democracy promotion, but Iraq only discredited the idea of promoting democracy with an aggressive war. The West was still happy to see a move towards democracy when it seemed spontaneous, like in 2011. But sometime between the Benghazi consulate attack and the fall of Mosul, the West lost its nerve, and not unlike Putin, decided the stability of dictatorship might actually be preferable to the chaos of revolution. This meant, in particular, standing by and letting what happens in Syria happen. And as the situation became more horrific, the more people craved a story that would excuse them of responsibility. Around the same time Russia had intervened at Ilovaisk, the Russians also started their intervention in Syria. When that war started, Russia's English-language propaganda also started pushing Putin's pet conspiracy theory that the Arab Spring had really all just been a CIA color revolution. And this theory was perfect for a West that was looking to wash its hands of Syria. If the Arab Spring had been real, not intervening in Syria in the name of stability would be a morally fraught position in which one was possibly sacrificing hundreds of thousands of lives for one's own convenience. If the Arab Spring had all just been a CIA plot, though, well then, opposing intervention in Syria becomes a selfless, brave, even heroic stand against vastly powerful forces. You get to pat yourself on the back for your humanitarianism while you watch a city get blown to bits. What all these color revolution stories have in common is that they are attempts to nullify democracy. Not to destroy it, though that's the real objective effect, but to prove it does not and cannot actually exist. Putin and various dictators are looking to prove democracy is a sham so people won't overthrow them, and a critical mass of Westerners have started promoting their narrative for an altogether more pathetic reason. Because if it were true, well, no one has to take responsibility for anything. If democracy can't really exist, the people of Russia don't have to ask themselves what opportunities they threw away through cowardice or cynicism. If everything is just being controlled by deep state puppet strings, no one in America really has moral responsibility for the war in Iraq. And if democracy doesn't really exist, it was never really at stake in Syria, and so on and so on. The global flight towards conspiracy theories is usually framed as hapless idiots who don't know who to trust because they've been lied to by the respectable authorities, and can barely be blamed if they end up in the embrace of insane grifters. I don't think people are so stupid. If nothing else, they're certainly smart enough to only embrace conspiracy theories that exonerate them of doing any wrongdoing. No, I think what we really have here is a sort of crowdsourced alibi. People are trading freedom for innocence, and populist leaders are perfectly happy to tell people they're innocent in exchange for more power. The only hole in the alibi is Ukraine. Of every revolution in the 2010s, only one succeeded, Euromaidan. The Ukrainians, they took their destiny into their own hands and won. And that's why they have to die. Because if they can do it, we can do it. We could have done it, which means democracy is and can be real, and the rest of us do, in fact, bear responsibility for what's going wrong in our politics. And I think that's why everyone, supporters and opponents, feel in their guts that this war is important for democracy. Not because Ukraine happens to be a democracy and Russia happens to be a dictatorship, but because Russia and the world has turned this war into a test of whether it's still possible for regular people to go up against entrenched power and win. And a surprising number of regular people want that to be impossible. So that's pretty bleak. But don't worry, I think I can make it bleaker. Because Russia is not the only country where the LaRouche movement has made it into influential circles.
15 U.S. representatives from the Schiller Institute are on a visit to China to learn about the country's development. On Friday, they met with students and teachers from Tsinghua University in Beijing to exchange views on mutual concerns.
Since around 2015, Chinese media has been full of stories about how America is planning a color revolution in China. That rhetoric reached its zenith during the Hong Kong protests, but it's also been appearing regularly in coverage about Xinjiang, where the Strike Hard campaign has been promoted as being necessary to preempt the separatism being funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. And according to at least one White House staffer, in private conversations with the president, Xi Jinping himself has complained about the threat of a color revolution. Maybe this is just propaganda. Maybe no one in the Central Committee really believes this stuff, and behind the paranoid conspiracy theories is a more rational strategy. But that's the bet we made with Russia. What I do know is that whatever Xi believes, Chinese media is now flush with American anti-war conspiracy theorists explaining to the Chinese that America hates them and is planning to launch a preemptive war against them.
China itself is under threat. These American bases form a giant noose, encircling China with missiles, bombers, warships.
The United States is threatening war with China.
In one sense, is the US already at war with China?
Yes, on the ground and in the air.
A perfect match for the right-wing anti-war conspiracy theorists, who are now explaining to the American people that they are already under attack from the Chinese government.
Is a hidden China menace right here on our soil. Sister cities.
We spend an awful lot of time on the show talking about China, its intentions, its crimes, its treatment of dogs.
They're going to attack with a bolt from the blue. They're going to destroy our satellites in orbit. They're going to destroy our communications equipment. We're not going to be fighting about transgender issues on TikTok anymore because TikTok's not going to work in the United States.
On the list of accomplishments of the modern anti-war movement, starting the war in Ukraine may end up being a footnote. Wow, okay. I'm so sorry for making you guys wait as long as I did. I don't know. I got very perfectionist about this one. And I was just trying to cram too much information into too short a time. So in the future, I might take parts that I've excised out of this video and spin them off into their own videos. And some I might spin off just into YouTube shorts. So if you guys are interested in that, leave a comment. And now I want to say thank you to my patrons. Jack Brady, Krzysztof Kosinski, Love Letters, Peyton Miller, Matthias Hub, Sofastruck, Anthony John Cola, Strelick23, I. Ratman, Christopher DeClerc, Alex Zabara, Goon, Enrico Migliorini, Deadmove53, Rosie the Cat, Valute Breaker, Tired and Emotional, Cop Creature Shop, Dr. Majalis, Texture, Jacob Thompson, Display GFX, Vikantas Glodinus, Addicted to Chloroform, Sarah the Crocsune, Chris Hanshu, Maverick, Derek Gabriel Deards, Moss Config, Peanut Supreme, Yang Wei Feng, Carl von Classywitz, Game Warrior 010, Totally Useless, Dustin Lockwood, Heartman, Cullen, Crispy Bacon, Bernth, Aki665, Balint Kovac, Ananas, Taboon, Watch the Anime, Cat Planet Cuties, Ari and I, Red Rex, Rob Field, Armin Hindenburg, Carl Nyo, Joel Gomez, Bion, Gabo Tsai, Scott Beckett, Zach Christensen, Ryan Refner, Knowing Better, Tedsville, Big Nove, Diana Banana, and Gabo Tsai.